We start tonight with new signs of weakness in the two areas that could be the most damaging to Trump's political fate: the economy and cracking down on immigration. Politico reporting a growing number of Republicans in Congress are anxious about the Trump economy and, quote, starting to feel queasy, with Trump's China trade war and market-rattling tweets increasingly alarming the GOP. And they are not just worried about Trump's reelection. They're worried about themselves. In fact, Senate Republicans fearing any slowdown will make it harder for them to keep the Senate in their hands, and growing signs that they should be worried. In fact, a new poll finding more people disapprove of Trump's handling of the economy than they approve of it. Now, in the middle of all of this, Trump, as you can imagine, lashing out, even taking shots at Fox News, saying that channel isn't working for him anymore. We'll have more on that later on in the show. And with all of the economic jitters, new scrutiny on the lengths Trump is going to in order to fulfill his campaign promise to build a wall. Democrats growing alarmed by his reported promise of pardons if aides have to break the law in order to get that wall built. One House Democrat saying it is appalling and worthy of further investigation, and adds to Judiciary Committee's ongoing investigation into whether or not to recommend impeachment. With me on all of this, Reverend Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC, Rutgers University professor Brittany Cooper, and Katty Kay, Washington anchor for BBC News. Great to have everyone with us. Rev, let me begin with you, if I may. The economy has been the one thing a lot of people will turn a blind eye to President Trump. They'll ignore a lot of the racism. They'll ignore a lot of the rhetoric, immigration, if the economy is doing well. If these two issues, the economy and immigration, begin to falter, does the president really have a chance at re-election?
I think that he is in serious trouble if the economy does start to falter. When you look at the fact now that you have farmers upset with him with the whole rhetoric around trade deals, and they're sitting there not being able to deal with product and not being able to do what, in fact, that they thought they would do. When you look at the fact that people are now in contractual jobs, and a lot of the numbers are being bolstered where people are not really employed like where they're getting jobs with benefits and all, but these are contractual jobs. These things, these chickens are coming home to roost. And I think he can tell people, he can call people names and tell people all kind of pipe dreams. But when you know you can't pay your bills and you can't make ends meet, and he promised you that he would, I think he's going to have problems even in his base if he can't turn the economy
people have
around.
a harder time accepting the lies if they don't see their bank accounts off, doing better off.
You can't lie about the food's not on the table.
So to that point, Bernie, is Trump here in panic mode when you kind of look at the way he's been lashing out? People have been trying to explain his erratic behavior either on the world stage, at the G7 summit, or when he's here tweeting up a storm about the most random things.
Right. I mean, so part of what he does is give us faux outrage when he gets called out. And, you know, if you've ever caught a person in a lie and they sort of act out like, how dare you think that I would say that, right?
Yeah.
It's always misdirection. So he's doing a little bit of that. But one of the things I would challenge the American people to think about is think about how they feel, right? Folks are exhausted. Folks are working harder than they've ever worked. People can sense that their quality of life has gone down even from 20 years ago. We work harder. We make less. We know that wages haven't risen with the cost of living. And so we also know about Trump that he actually has a huge history of doing shady business deals that fall apart. And now there's a referendum in the American public because people tried to lay that to the side in 2016, and now they're becoming casualties. But this is entirely consistent with the way that Trump does business. He's a man who gives many big promises. He always overpromises and underdelivers, and that's what's happening.
And so to that point, Katty, in Washington, D.C., when you hear the Judiciary Committee wanting to launch an investigation into him possibly hosting the G7 summit in Doral next year, how serious are these investigations, even the ones into his possible pardoning of those that break the law to build the wall? How serious are those investigations compared to how vulnerable he is on the economic front?
Look, I think his vulnerability on the economic front is the thing that is preoccupying the White House most at the moment. The message to Donald Trump, the single most important message to Donald Trump from the G7 leaders who he met last weekend was, you're messing with the world economy. And that he is hearing because he's seeing the impacts of that on American growth, on job growth figures that are being revised down month by month, on the clouds that are here on the American economy and on the global economy, on the stock market feeling nervous, and it's all about the trade war. I mean, the irony of this is that it doesn't need to be happening. There could be strong economic growth prospects, but the White House realizes, I think, that you can't have it both ways, that you may have to give up either the trade war with China because that's impacting the economy, or give up the economic growth, which is the thing that got Mr. Trump elected in the first place. And this is not going to get better, right? All of the forecasts are that we are heading into a recession. We're not coming out of a recession. And the question for the White House has to be one of timing. And are they prepared to kind of take a gamble that it happens after next November, when some economists are saying it could happen beforehand?
So, Rev, do you think that he is rattled by all of this, the investigations, the economy, the world economy? Is he rattled?
Oh, he's absolutely rattled. When you look at his behavior, and you look at the fact that he's just working overtime, just attacking everybody. The Fed chair, when you have someone, Eamon, that says, is the Fed chair or the president of China the enemy? That's somebody that has left us in terms of being rational. And he actually said this and put it in writing. It's not something that somebody taped. He put it on Twitter. So he's definitely rattled, because where does his justification come? If Barack Obama, who he's obsessively attacked, took us out of the jaws of a recession, and now economists are saying you're bringing us back into a recession when you tried to take credit for all that Obama did in growing the economy. That's his worst nightmare, that he is the one that undid what Obama did and he took credit for.
Go ahead, Katie.
I mean, Eamon, the one thing I was going to say, the disconcerting thing for the White House is that there aren't the tools in the toolbox anymore to change this ship, to turn this economy around, right? I mean, Jay Powell could succumb to pressure and cut interest rates a little bit, but there's not much flexibility on monetary policy. There's not much he can do on taxes. The payroll tax isn't going to get through Congress. There's very little he can do fiscally. So what can he do? He could try to rectify the trade war with China, but he has escalated the trade war with China. And that's got to be a disconcerting position for the president to be in when he looks around and says, well, how am I going to fix this? There just isn't much left at his disposal to make a big impact on the American economy. He's done the big tax cut. That did juice the economy. It was the sugar high, and that's wearing off.
All right, so speaking of the trade war, Kev, that you just brought up, let me play you guys this soundbite, because Trump is being pressed about it by members of his own Republican Party. Watch this.
Pat Toomey, who I know you respect, Republican from Pennsylvania, says, the quote, "There's no question the trade uncertainty is contributing to the slowdown in our economy." Is he right?
So what does Pat Toomey want me to do? Does he want me to say, let me put my hands up, China, continue to rip us off?
All right, so you have that on one hand, Brittany. You've got that Pat Toomey comment, the president throwing up his hands. And then you got Senator Lindsey Graham also saying, you know what, we all got to take a little bit of pain, because that's what the president wants. So is the president feeling the heat and the pressure from within his own party?
Sure. Look, I'm actually more concerned because this is not a man who then retreats very easily. What he has done is he's pursued a policy of protectionism. And one of the things we know, if we look at the World War II example, is that protectionism and isolationism in the U.S. context does not work. And one of the ways that we got ourselves out of the slump of protectionism in the 1940s was that we entered World War II. And so I think that the other thing we should begin to watch is the continued military posturing towards all of these countries, because one of the old school American rescue missions is get us into a war, because that is often seen as another driver of the economy. And Trump wants one big key thing under his belt. He either wants his wall, he wants to ride out on the glory of the economy. And if he can't have that, I think that he's absolutely willing to start a physical war in order to do it.
And you think the economy's sinking is frightening, imagine our country at war with him as the commander-in-chief.
That's right.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to think about that. Let me get your thoughts on this, Rev, which is we saw in the 2018 midterms, it was somewhat of a referendum on President Trump. The result speaks for themselves in the House. One of the worst defeats for the GOP in the history of this country, or at least in the last couple of decades. If we see this trend continuing going into 2020, Is he going to be a liability for Republicans running up and down the ticket all across the country?
I think that he is, and I think when you see a lot of incumbent Republicans already announcing they're not running again, that a lot of them are saying, I can't win on a ticket with him, and it's getting worse and worse. I think that the challenge that the Democrats have is to come up with the candidate that can build the biggest tent and the most consensus and that knows how to deal with economic policies. They must be able to answer what Trump cannot answer. Because I think Brittany was right. The only thing he was successful in his career was The Apprentice. He never was good at business. He couldn't run his own businesses. How is he going to run the government? If you have somebody that understands how to deal with the economy and how to deal with trade relationships with people like China, just standing them on the stage with him would expose how much he doesn't know, which is why he has to name call.
Let me ask you guys about the that pardons that the president is allegedly asking people, according to both the Washington Post and the New York Times, that he is potentially offering pardons in exchange for them breaking the law. One House Democrat says Trump promising pardons is, quote, an abuse of the pardon power. It's an abuse of the president's authority, and it's very likely illegal. Katty Kay, how much could this factor into the ongoing impeachment conversation in D.C.?
We've already seen the issue of pardons come up in the impeachment proceedings with the case of Paul Manafort, right? And was he or was he not going to pardon Paul Manafort? He likes pardons. The president likes pardons. It's one of the few things he can do by fiat. He doesn't have to go to Congress. He's not limited legally in who he pardons and how he pardons. I think in this particular case on the issue of the wall, in the way that it's just come up now, the White House, as it has said before, this was a joke, right? He said he was going to pardon these people that were going to take the land illegally from people that didn't want to give up the land. But please, it was just a joke, and the press has lost its sense of humor. We hear that repeatedly from the White House, and then actually we find out with reporting a few weeks later that it was more than just a joke. Greenland was more than just a joke. It actually was something that the president had been interested in trying. So I don't take it too seriously, the White House's line that this was just a joke. I think this is probably something that the president has looked at, trying to get this land by force, and it will be another thing that the Democrats, if it happened, would want to bring up as part of the investigations. I mean, the problem for the Democrats, I think the Reverend is right, is all about who they can. The Democrats have to find a candidate and find a candidate who can beat Trump. The investigation is going to keep on going, but so far the indications in all of the polling is that those investigations have not massively swayed public opinion one way or another. They have not brought over Trumpers onto the side of thinking we need more of these investigations.
But I do think Democrats are actually making real headway in the debate about economic anxiety. I mean, we're having the most robust conversation on the left that we've had in my lifetime about how to actually meet the needs of real working class people. So I think that part of what Trump is going to do inadvertently is spur people to the left. And that's a thing that we actually need, because we need the Democratic Party to actually occupy the progressive center again, rather than being a center-left party.
Rev, last question before we let you guys go. President Trump has been talking about Puerto Rico. He's been tweeting about it. In fact, he's attacking Puerto Rico, calling it corrupt, and at a time when the territory could potentially be again facing a critical few days with the hurricane passing through. What is it with this president and the way that he, at the right time when the territory needs aid and needs kind of a rallying, he attacks the territory and diverts money away from FEMA disaster relief for building his wall? He
diverted money from FEMA at this time to build his wall that he told the world he was going to have Mexico pay for. Now all of a sudden he's taking FEMA funds. He insults the people of Puerto Rico and ends it by saying, I'm the best thing that ever happened to Puerto Rico. I guess that was when he was throwing paper towels at them when he went down there the last hurricane. It is insulting, and it shows the epitome of insensitivity when, mind you, he did all this yesterday when we felt the hurricane may hit them dead on. And it is an absolute insensitive president that is totally about himself. All he sees, megalomania is an understatement when it comes to Donald Trump.
I think the safest thing people have said, he's possibly tone deaf to the needs of the people of Puerto Rico, that he can't even be. empathetic to them at a time of needs.
Oh, it's too generous.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's very egregious. Remember, this is the 14th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina making landfall in New Orleans. That was a FEMA disaster, and it also sullied the George W. Bush presidency as well. This is a real misstep, and it suggests not a tone deafness, but an active disregard for people of color and folks from working class communities.
And it's not limited to Puerto Rico, because you saw how he rushed and took care of background checks after he visited El Paso and Dayton. You saw how quickly we got that, right?
Yeah, Reverend Al Sharpton, Brittany Cooper, Katty Kay, thank you very much for joining us this hour. Thank you, guys.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.